In our last lecture, we looked at the portraits of Agamemnon and Achilles in the Iliad of Homer. The Iliad is truly a great book, and I would define a great book as one that deals with a great theme. And as we saw, the theme of the Iliad is nothing less than life itself. What is its meaning? It also needs to be written in noble language, and any language can be noble. But the Iliad in particular creates a rapport between what is elevated and poetic and what is sound and solid. Its descriptions, its similes, its metaphors live with us and live through the ages. Which brings us to the third criterion for a great book, and that is it speaks across the ages. It is universal. And how many generations have told and retold the story of Troy? And part of that universality, that is Homer, is his ability to create a viable, indeed, and enduring portrait of the enemy, of Hector. And when we have read the Iliad, or when Homer's audience listen to it, Hector stays with us just as much as do Achilles and Agamemnon. The Iliad was composed about the year 750 BC. And it was composed for a Greek audience, but one that was living in the very homeland of the Trojans. For starting about 1000 BC, Greeks had migrated across the sea and settled all along the coast of what they called Asia Minor, what we would call Turkey today. And the Iliad was composed there for an audience which knew, by historical tradition of these great events, it was a statement of the ethnic pride of the Greeks in their great victory, but it also pays homage to the man of honor and valor, Hector, who fought against them. Hector is a mighty warrior. He is a soldier. He glories in war. At the same time, he is a compassionate and loving father and husband. He is a patriot. He is a tragic hero who knows that Troy must fall and yet fights on because the cause is the noblest, patriotism. As he says at one point when there's a question about omens that have occurred, the best omen is to fight for your country. Let us get on with it. For the best is simply to do our duty. Now, bravery without a sense of honor is mere savagery. And the code of values for Hector, as for Achilles, centers around the ideal of honor. If we wish a fourth criterion for a great book, it is that it summarizes the values of an age at its height. And the Iliad is the summation of the heroic age, that age in which warfare is the basic element of human existence, in which plunder is part of life, and in which great heroes fight above all for the sake of their honor and their glory. So it was that Achilles had been asked early on in life, did he want a long and peaceful and wealthy life, or did he want a short life that would leave behind forever glory? And he chose without hesitation glory. And glory is also central to Hector. As Achilles and Agamemnon are foils for one another, so Hector and his brother Paris are foils for one another, both of them among the many children of King Priam of Troy. Paris had, it was foretold, had the omen that he would one day be the ruin of his country. And so his father sent him away to be a shepherd. And there he was, Paris, tending his flocks, when one day 3 divine beauties come down upon him, descend upon him. They had been at a banquet, and the goddess of discord, the only divine figure not invited to this great banquet on Olympus, had rolled in an apple that said, "To the fairest." Athena, Hera, Aphrodite all reached for it. Hera, the queen of the gods, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, but also a warrior goddess. They all reached for it. And I told Zeus, you decide. Now you see right there, Homer understands human nature when he refers to this story towards the very end of the Iliad. Zeus is a very good CEO. He knows to pass this on down. There's no way you can win this choice. So he passes it on down to Paris, who is foolish enough to accept it. Now, each of the goddesses promises him a bribe. Hera, for example, will make him a mighty king. Athena will lead him to victory in war. But Aphrodite knows Paris, and she offers him the most beautiful of women. And right there he makes that choice. You see how unheroic Paris is. And that is what leads him to Sparta and to the seduction of the beautiful Helen. And so he brings her back, and with it brings war upon his country. And thus it is that Hector is forced to fight this war brought about by this ignoble deed. And yet once the war is joined, honor forces Hector and the Trojans to continue. At any point, they could make a negotiated peace. And in fact, this is offered to them fairly early in the Iliad. Let us make a negotiated peace. Or let there be a duel between Menelaus, who has been wronged, and Paris, who has wronged him. That is taken up by the Trojans, but Paris slips away by divine aid and goes back home. So he acts again dishonorably. But even though they have been dishonored twice by Paris, the Trojans will not give in. And at the heart of their resistance is Hector. Honor is his moral compass, and his courage in battle makes his men devoted to him. And yet, there's also in Homer a strong romantic strain. And one of the most moving passages in the Iliad is when the old men of Troy are gathered up on the wall, and they're looking out over the mighty heroes of the Greeks. And Helen comes among them, and they ask her, point out this hero, point out Ajax or Diomedes, who is that great strong fellow there? And the old men of Troy turn to one another and say, Nemesis. It is no shame. It is no shame to have gone to war for someone as beautiful as Helen. Nemesis. No shame. We see Hector at the very moment of challenging the Greeks. He shouts out, I will fight any one of you, man to man. And at the end, when I have killed you, a great tomb will be erected to you, and men will see it from afar as they sail and say, this man was worthy to have been killed by great Hector. So such is his self-confidence. Or the terrifying scene of Hector ripping apart from its very hinges the gates of the Greek camp. He is a fearsome warrior. Or when he stands facing Patroclus in man-to-man combat and drives his spear deep into Patroclus. And Patroclus says, now, Hector, you have killed me. But I tell you this, you will die not long afterwards. And Hector says, if I die, I die. It matters not. But who knows? It may be that the gods will intercede and Troy will live. Either way, you are dead. And then Homer describes how he wrenches the spear out and kicks the body of Patroclus away and then hurls it towards a chariot driver, striking him in the back. And yet, this same Hector appears in such loving devotion to his family. He goes back into the city of Troy as the battle rages back and forth, realizing that only the help of the gods can save his city and his country. And he goes first into the palace, seeks out his mother, who comes to him and says, let me feed you, let me give you something to drink. And he says, I cannot drink or eat while the battle rages. You must picture him as ancient warfare was, all splattered with the blood and intestines of men that he has killed. I cannot eat or drink, nor can I offer up sacrifices to the gods, polluted with death as I am. But you, mother, and the fair women of Troy, offer up sacrifices. Offer up the finest things that we have in order to win the favor of the gods and goddesses to turn back this terrible tide of war. And now I just want to see my wife. And first, though, I want to find my brother, because where is Paris? He slipped away. He's back here somewhere, and the battle is raging. So he goes first into the bedroom of Paris and Helen, their beautiful apartment. And there is his brother Paris, or Alexander is his other name, sitting there fiddling with a bow and arrow. And he has just been in bed with the beautiful Helen. And he says, daimon, that is the word he uses. It is a word much like, my friend, old fellow, buddy, you are the strangest person I have ever seen. What are you doing sitting here, playing with a bow and arrow, here in the bedroom of your wife, when battle is raging? And Paris says, I know, I shouldn't really mind that you're scolding me. I deserve it. I don't know why I'm this way, but I'm ready to go fight some more. And then Helen says, I wish I had a husband like you, Hector. I have this worthless creature that has caused all of this trouble. And you, Hector, of all the people in Troy, you have never blamed me. You have never said a single harsh word to me, though I have brought all this misery upon you. You fight this war that is just because of me, yet you have always been the soul of courtesy. We think almost of the knight in Chaucer, who is the very soul of chivalry and honor, truth, freedom, and courtesy. The gentleness towards women, ever polite towards them. That is Hector the warrior towards Helen. And then he goes looking for his wife. And his wife, Andromache, is so devoted to him that the very word that he is back in the city of Troy sends her running through the streets, a nurse carrying their little baby. And she can't find him. She runs from tower to tower. And then suddenly she hears he's back at their house and rushes to meet him. And then the scene of Hector embracing his wife. And she says, why won't you stay here? We can fight from the walls. We have this magnificent citadel. Make the Greeks besiege our city and capture it. We can hold out forever. And he says, honor won't allow it. We must fight them outside the walls, and there do battle and win. Honor will not allow it, he says. And then he turns to his little baby, and again, Homer captures so magnificently. The little creature is shocked. He doesn't know his daddy in this helmet and with the blood over him, and he cries. Hector pushes back his helmet and says, there, it's Daddy. He even has a special little name for his little boy. And he says, now, you will grow up and be a warrior. You will be greater even than your dad. That is my promise and hope for you. It is a man's world, and he says to his wife, Andromache, what hurts me most of all is that if we lose, you will be taken captive. And men will say, as you work hard as a slave, she was the wife of great Hector. How could this have happened? But now I must go back into the fray. And as he is walking out towards the city gates, his brother Paris joins up with him, all ready for battle. And Hector says, again, old fellow, you are so strange. You are as good in battle as any man. Why do you allow them to talk like this about you? Paris says, I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm not like you. And Hector says again, so charitable. Don't worry about it. We'll fight this battle, and who knows, we may win. And when it is over, when we have restored and preserved the day of liberty, that is the phrase, the day of liberty for our wives and our children, then we'll offer up sacrifices to the gods and goddesses, and all will be well. And the two of them march out together. How could you not feel noble toward such a hero, or pride in an Achilles who will ultimately bring him down? And it is in their final confrontation, when Hector and Achilles meet outside the walls of Troy, that Homer again shows us this gift of making the enemy champion human. For as they are facing one another, as Hector is brought to confrontation with the mighty Achilles himself, he turns and runs. 3 times he runs around the walls of Troy. He stops only when the goddess Athena, in disguise as his own brother, stands beside him, and thinking it is his brother, Hector thinks he has an ally to help him fight. And his brother says, I have more spears for us. Then he stands and fights, only to find out as the moment of truth comes that it is Athena, not his brother, and he is deserted, and there is no spear for him. Why does he flee and run? Because even the bravest of men has that moment of doubt. He's not an action hero, a Superman. He's a very real man who has risen to this challenge. And so he ultimately does stand and fight and take his spear through the throat and dies, his armor clattering upon him, his soul flitting away, leaving youth and manhood behind. Hector is for Homer that gallant hero who gives meaning to the victorious side. He knows, and he says, it is clear that Troy must fall. The gods have willed it, and Priam's people will disappear. But he fights on until the very end, doing all he can to keep off this day of slavery. The Romans knew this. Polybius and Livy, in writing the history of the great war with Hannibal, they make Hannibal into a mighty figure who can still, centuries later, terrify Roman children just by his name. And yet Hannibal lacks this human quality of Hector. He is nothing but the ferocious lion of war. And Hector, I think, is much more like Robert E. Lee in our own American Civil War, who would say towards the very end of the war, it is going to end. It will end just the way I knew it would from the beginning. But who fought the war and who followed his course of honor. Now, our Civil War is real. The Battle of Cannae and the war with Hannibal is real. We ask ourselves the question, though, if Homer is writing 750 BC, if the Greeks would have dated the Trojan War 500 years earlier, is there any historical kernel to this? You might say, does it matter? After all, there are great stories that have no historical kernel whatsoever, like Star Wars. But I think it important to discover if this great struggle at Troy was a memory of something real and true, and whether figures like Achilles and Agamemnon and Hector really existed. Now, if this were a teaching company course, perhaps a kind of Chautauqua 150 years ago, a learned professor would stand here and tell you, no, there was no Trojan War, and there is no purpose in going in search of it. You might as well go and look for Camelot, they would have told you. Both of them, King Arthur and the Iliad, are just fairy tales. Rich, interesting fairy tales, but fairy tales. It was not a professor, but a businessman, Heinrich Schliemann, who would change forever the way we view the Iliad and the great story of the Odyssey. He was born in Germany in 1822. His father was a pastor, Lutheran pastor, but the father had trouble handling money. He had an affair with the chambermaid and ultimately was thrown out of his pastorate for this womanizing and for embezzling funds. And young Heinrich had to go and live with his uncle. He was denied a real education. He was denied that education in the classics, which was a very staple of a gentleman's education in the Germany of his day. And instead, pretty early on, about the age of 14, he was sent off to work in a grocery store there in the north of Germany and Prussia. And one day, as he was there handling big crates of pickled herrings and handling bunches of potatoes, a mill hand came in and ordered some vodka and began to drink and drank and drank and drank. And then finally the mill hand began, drunk as he was, Meni naide thea peliadi achilios. And Schliemann said, "What is that?" And the mill hand said, "Why, that's the first line of the Iliad in Greek." "How do you know it?" He said, "Well, you know, my parents sent me to a classical school, and look what it got me. Here I am, a drunken mill hand." He said, "That's all right. Would you like some more vodka?" "Well, yeah." "If I give you more vodka, will you say that over again?" "Yes. In fact, I can give you more lines than that. Just keep giving me vodka." And he did. And Schliemann said, "You know what? I have right here a book. It was a Christmas present from my father, one of the few things I have from him. And look, here is an engraving of the siege of Troy and of burning Troy. I tell you something. One of these days, I am not only going to read Greek, but I am going to find Troy." The mill hand would have said, "Well, but my teachers told us it doesn't exist. It's just a fable." "No, it is real. I am sure of it." Now, denied a university education, which is so available to so many people today, perseverance would be the school of Heinrich Schliemann. He would get out of the grocery store and decide he was going to go to America. But he was shipwrecked. Barely gotten into the North Sea when he was shipwrecked, washed up on the coast of Holland. Did he give up? No. Went to Amsterdam, got a job as a bookkeeper. It was a firm that did a great deal of business with Russia. And no one in that firm knew the difficult Russian language. Schliemann taught it to himself, one of many languages he would teach himself, and then went off to St. Petersburg. While working for the company that had sent him there, he became a multi-millionaire on his own, investing very, very wisely in all kinds of commodities. The Crimean War was a great gift to him in terms of increasing his fortune. He married a Russian woman. He was, in fact, in America at the time that California became a state of the Union, and thus always claimed American citizenship as a result of that. He had gone out there to see to the remains and estate of his brother, who had died of a fever in California. And then he had made himself rich enough by the late 1860s to stop his business dealings and to follow his dream of searching for Troy. He traveled in the Mediterranean. He took a few courses at the Sorbonne. He had great marital difficulties with his Russian wife and decided to divorce her. And the only way he could divorce her, he decided quickly enough, was to go to the United States. So he came to the United States, found out that Indiana had the easiest divorce laws. Went out to Indiana, got there, found out you still had to be a resident for a year in order to get divorced. And somehow within 2 weeks at the Indianapolis courthouse showed up 5 witnesses to swear that he had lived there for the requisite time. So he got his divorce and then wrote off to a priest in Greece that he knew and said, "I want to marry a Greek woman. She must know ancient Greek fluently." And so he went to Athens and was introduced to the woman who would be the true companion for his life. And his first question to us, as he tells it, was, "Recite some of the Iliad." And she did so beautifully that he realized she was his dream. And so they married, and then he went off seriously to search for Troy. Now, Troy in those days, Turkey, was part of the Ottoman Empire, a corrupt bureaucratic system that the wealth of Schliemann was able to buy sufficiently, to give enough bribes, finally to get permission to dig at a great mound called Hissarlik. Now remember, the best professors of the day say Troy never existed. And those few who would agree that it exists was said absolutely it was not at Hissarlik. But Schliemann believed Homer, like a gospel, and he believed the ancients. And the Greeks and Romans had believed that Hissarlik had been the site of ancient Troy, and there in fact had been in classical times a city there called Ilion. And Schliemann began to dig. And by the end of his first season, by 1870, it was clear that he was coming upon a major prehistoric site. Now, his methods are criticized today. It is said that he dug down too rapidly, that he didn't give sufficient attention to stratigraphy, and all of this is true. But there were no professional archaeologists at the time. Archaeology as a science did not exist. What digging had been done were of great barrows, for example, in England, where they just sliced down to whatever grave goods were there. And Schliemann learned as he went along. He hired architects, he hired classical scholars, and he improved his methodology year by year, season by season. And then there was that glorious spring day in 1873 when, as he tells the story, he saw just a glimmer of something in the ground. He told the workmen that it was a holiday he had forgotten about and sent them away, and just with his wife began to dig and uncover. And there they found the gold of Troy. Homer described Troy as rich in gold, and that is what they found. Magnificent pieces of gold necklaces. It was but the beginning of Schliemann's great contribution to knowledge. Fired by what he had learned in Troy, he then asked the question, if there were a Troy, and he was to prove that there was a great city on that site at the very time the Greeks believed the Trojan War occurred, that it was surrounded by great walls, similar to the walls described in Homer, even down to the angles that Homer describes. Homer describes how the warriors try to climb up the angles in the walls, and there were angles in his walls. There was a great megaron, or central hallway, that was the main feature of the palace that he thought to be the palace of Priam. That Troy had undergone a great siege. There were massive vessels of pottery for storage, and that it had been captured and burned by human hands in the very period the Greeks believed the Trojan War had occurred. But he asked the question, if there were a Troy, what proof is there that an expedition could be sent from Greece? Were there mighty cities like Mycenae? Because in classical times, Mycenae was such a small place that only 80 men were sent from it at the time of the Persian Wars. How could it have been the center of political power in Greece that was described by Homer? And so he went to Mycenae, got permission to excavate, and there found in 1876 graves, circular graves, shaft graves, and digging down to the very bottom found the remains of what he believed to be Agamemnon, a golden mask created as a death mask for a king. Spears and shields, weapons of a warlike society. And he cabled the king of Greece and said, I look today upon the face of your ancestors. And sure enough, Mycenae had been a powerful city in the day of the Trojan War. And it was Heinrich Schliemann who opened up for us this vast world of Mycenaean archaeology and showed the truth of the Iliad. Now, the professors were slow to give in. In fact, the first real recognition he received came from Gladstone, William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Britain, who believed that Homer, as a great source of ethical wisdom, must be true, must be telling the truth about the stories. And Schliemann went to London, lectured before the British Museum, and still the professors kept picking at him. And time again he was challenged, and it was said that he had salted his remains and planted these grave goods. In 1890, continuing to excavate at Troy, he would be struck down in Naples. He had gone to visit the excavations at Pompeii and died on Christmas Day, walking across the streets of Naples. But his legacy lives on. It has been challenged even today, and professors have engaged in what we might call a revenge of the nerds, trying to prove that Schliemann was a pathological liar, that his diary was falsified. What they cannot disprove is the reality of great Troy there where Homer said it was, and not just of Mycenae, but of sites like Pylos, the city of Nestor, a desert in antiquity, but in the time of Homer, the 13th century BC, the site of a great palace, where tablets were found showing that this society was not only a warrior society, but a society which kept careful records, and the records were kept in Greek. And they speak of the ships and the war chariots. They preserve the remains of helmets and shields, unknown in the 5th century BC, but alive in the pages of Homer. And so, Troy was real, Agamemnon was real, the Trojan War was a real event that left forever to the Greeks this legacy of honor, courage, valor, and devotion. In our next lecture, we will turn to the aftermath of the Trojan War and to the figure of Odysseus.